Hello everybody, welcome to Conscientious Omnivore. For anybody who's new to my channel, thanks for stopping by. If you do like the content, please consider subscribing and sharing with a friend. I greatly appreciate that. Today I'm going to be talking about the vegan diet and how it impacts your health, and specifically how it can help improve your health, or at the very least maintain it. I think this is a really important topic, and one of the aims of this channel is to get into kind of the ethical side of veganism as well. But I'm going to save that for later videos, because I think the first topic I really want to cover is health. I truly believe the expression that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. I think that's really kind of the main reason why a lot of people are considering changes to their diet to begin with, and I also think that that's a good way to introduce kind of my thoughts on the topic of veganism. So what I will be doing is going through a presentation that I actually gave to a bunch of my coworkers and some friends and family, and I hope that you find it informative and helpful. And I do have references for all of the studies and things that I talk about in the presentation, and I will post the entire presentation so you can download it yourself and look through it. And I encourage everybody to read through the studies. You can really get kind of a lot of useful information, and hopefully you find it helpful as well. So thanks again for stopping by. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and yeah, let's get into it. I want to start by talking about some of the leading causes of death. Then I'm going to also talk about various illnesses and how they're affected by dietary changes, and then kind of show you some of the ways that a vegan diet can help with all of these conditions and illnesses. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that the leading cause of death worldwide is by and far heart disease. So it kills more people than any other cause of death. The latest statistics I could find were from 2015. You can see that over 8.7 million people die from heart disease each year. So that's an incredible figure. I mean, it's astounding. And there's also an additional 6.2 million people who die from stroke, and that comes in at second place. And as you'll see in the presentation, stroke and heart disease, they are related, or that they often have similar causes. So the other thing to note is that these leading causes haven't changed in the past 15 years. So these two causes have been right at the top of the list. In the U.S.A, the stats for these leading causes of death are actually slightly different. I think that probably has to do with the fact that the different standards of living, and also the extent to which American diets are generally very poor, and it causes additional cancers. And so in the U.S. you can see that almost a quarter of deaths are attributed to heart disease, and then cancer comes in at second place with 22.5%. So let's get into what causes heart disease. Atherosclerosis is the scientific name for heart disease. It is caused by high cholesterol, and other risk factors are actually contributory. They make it worse, but they don't cause atherosclerosis. And this is a belief that's held by William C. Roberts, and he is the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology. So this man has spent 50 years studying heart disease and looking at the causes of it, and that's his standpoint that basically it is a disease caused by high levels of cholesterol. So another thing that's really important to note is that scientific research has shown without a doubt that any intake level above 0 of either trans fats, saturated fat, or cholesterol will increase your blood serum cholesterol levels. And the last point I have here is that cholesterol and saturated fat are really primarily found in animal foods. Cholesterol is only found in animal foods, so cholesterol cannot be found in plant foods. Certain plant foods do have saturated fat, and there has been a lot of talk lately about coconut oil. Coconuts do have a fairly good amount of saturated fat, so if you did eat a lot of coconuts, that could raise your cholesterol as well. But for the most part, most plant foods do have very low saturated fat, and most animal foods actually have pretty high saturated fat. So just something to know. Next topic is really who gets heart disease. And the sad truth is that pretty much everybody eating a Western diet will, have the risk of succumbing to heart disease. This is not new information. Back in 1953, there were soldiers coming back in body bags, unfortunately, from the Korean War in the U.S., and they did autopsies on them. Most of these people were, young people in their 20s, prime of life, etc. And what they found was that a shocking 77% of them already had arterial blockage and at least the beginning stages of heart disease. So this was actually so surprising to scientists that they then decided that they wanted to see how early does this begin. And what they found was they did autopsies on children, and that they could see the first stages of the disease, which are the aortic fatty streaks, by the age of 10. So this was quite shocking, and they kind of had low numbers of autopsies that they could go to, so they decided to do more. And subsequently they did thousands of autopsies, and they found that from people ages 15 to 34, these were all people who died from accidental causes. They confirmed that high LDL, that's the quote-unquote bad cholesterol, those levels are the greatest risk factors that you have for developing heart disease. So very briefly, I want to give a few examples of who doesn't get heart disease. And, this is an example that, a lot of people might know about. It's from the Isle of Crete. This is near Greece. Basically, what they found was that in the mainland Greece, people were getting really high levels of heart disease, and the government wanted to do something about it. So what they did was, they looked at the Isle of Crete, because there they had really low incidence of heart disease. And you can see here that they had heart attack rates, fatal heart attack rates, 20 times lower than what you saw in the U.S. at the same time. This was back in the 50s. So what they did was they analyzed what the people on the island ate, and what they found was that they ate 93% of their calories from plants. They only ate meat once or twice a week. So not per day, once or twice a week. Very, very low concentration of animal foods that they were eating. And what they also found was that even on the same island, there were a small class of rich people who ate meat every day because they could afford it, and they had the same rates of heart attack. So they had the high the high rate of heart disease, just like everyone else on the mainland. So this study is actually kind of famous because this is where the Mediterranean diet as a phrase emerged. And of course that's been distorted nowadays, where everybody thinks that the Mediterranean diet is like you eat just tons of fish and smother everything with olive oil and you're healthy. And of course that's not true. Another group of people who don't get heart disease, or were not known for it anyway, is the people in Okinawa. So they were the longest lived people anywhere. And of course that's changed now because they've started eating the Western diet, and they're now in actually pretty poor health. But back in the 40s and 50s, after World War II, they had dietary records that showed 96% of their calories came from plants. Most of those, actually, I think it was something like 2/3, came from yams, sweet potatoes, purple sweet potatoes. And the only people who actually lived even longer than them are the Okinawans, who were the Adventist Okinawans living in California subsequently, because they didn't eat any meat at all. They are primarily, I think for religious reasons, vegetarian for the most part. Another group of people who don't have heart disease common among them are the Tarahumara Indians of Mexico. So these people you may have heard of from people like, who was the guy who wrote the book, Born to Run? Anyway, I can't remember. I'll put it in the notes in the description. But there's a great book called Born to Run. And basically, that book talks about the Tarahumara Indians and their incredible feats of running. They call themselves the running people in their own language. They're known for running up to 200 miles in these friendly kind of cross-tribal races over the course of 2 days. And, old people take part as well. So you can see people in their 70s, 80s, 90s doing extreme distance running and being really healthy. The records from the 1970s, when they studied these people, showed that they ate primarily beans and corn. They would, occasionally roast a field mouse if they caught one or something, but for the most part they were eating beans and corn. The saturated fat that they ate comprised only 2% of their calories, so very, very little of their daily intake was coming from saturated fat. The primary source, of course, was the carbohydrates, the beans and the corn, mostly the starches that gave up 75 to 80% of their calories. Who else doesn't get heart disease? Well, D.P. Burkitt back in the 60s, I guess 1950s and 60s, studied a lot of people in Uganda and other areas of Africa. And what he showed was that the Western diseases were certainly caused by diet. The reason why he was led to believe that is that he observed the people there eating their traditional diets, the same group of people, if they moved to a Western country and they started adopting the Western diet, by even just the second generation, their immediate children, they were already getting the same rates of heart disease and all the other Western diseases like diabetes and everything else. So he was led to believe that it's not genetic. And there will be other examples in the presentation here that you'll see that reinforces that idea. So another great example that really shows you kind of the power of the change that you can achieve by changing your diet, and also shows you that things aren't always necessarily just genetic, is the case of Finland. In the 1970s, the mortality rate for the Finnish men from heart disease was the highest in the world. So nowhere else were more people dying from heart disease. And the government went to the World Health Organization and they decided to do something about it. So they did a bunch of interventions. They focused on reducing saturated fat intake. They did things like convincing through monetary incentives dairy farmers to switch from dairy to berry farming. They also had like contests set up where villagers would compete against each other to see who could lower their cholesterol scores, more. And 25 years later, they achieved incredible results. So you can see that the mean cholesterol levels were reduced by 17%. Blood pressures were brought down under control. Coronary heart disease deaths among the men was reduced by an astounding 65%. So that's just shocking when you see that number. And the other thing that's really interesting here is that because they reduced the rate of deaths from heart disease by such a huge number, it actually dropped the overall mortality by 45% for the country, which is just amazing. And just to put it into real terms, what you have to realize is that increased the life expectancy for men by 7 years and 6 years for women. So that's an additional 7 years that as a guy you would be able to live, based on these dietary changes. Same thing for women, 6 years. That's an incredible, feat. Okay, so, in general, who doesn't get heart disease? Well, there's studies that show that basically anybody with LDL levels below, 70, so between 50 and 70 is considered ideal, and this level guarantees that you won't get atherosclerosis. Where do you see this, and among what kind of groups of people? Well, you see this in healthy babies when they're born. You see this in hunter-gatherers, people living in like primitive, traditional kind of lifestyles, and you also see this in primates living in the wild. Also, if you want to look at total cholesterol instead of the LDL, people who have total cholesterol scores below 150, you do not see heart disease related, atherosclerotic plaque buildup. So just as an aside, because I really don't want this to be, about my personal anecdotes, but I do have to say that my personal LDL levels dropped from almost 118 to 58, and my total dropped from almost 190 down to 104. And that was after eating a healthy, whole food plant-based diet for about a year. So that's a pretty astounding change. I, cut my LDL in half. And the next question is, of course, if you already have heart disease, well, what can you do about it and can you reverse it? Especially considering that, like I said, pretty much everybody eating a Western diet, you're already likely got the first stages going by the time you're around 8 years old. So the good news is, yes, you can reverse the damage, and the healthy vegan diet is actually the only one that's been clinically proven to do so. So there's angiograms and all sorts of kind of scientific proof showing this, and showing that arteries can be unclogged, basically, by reversing the buildup of the plaque and changing your diet. So even some of this is actually not new information. You can actually see studies going back decades showing this. I've linked a couple in here, so you can see patients with severe angina, that's the chest pains that are typically associated with like really severe atherosclerosis. You had patients who could barely walk, a few steps without severe pain. They were up to walking 10 miles a day by changing their diet. In another case that's documented in 1964, a guy was literally climbing mountains after a few months on a vegan diet. And I want you to contrast that with, what the, medical route is going with, like, big pharma solutions. Drug treatments in 2013, which cost like thousands of dollars a year, when they did tests to see how long they can prolong exercise duration for people before the angina kicks in. The highest doses that they could give to people only helped increase their duration by 33.5 seconds. So compare that with the guy going up the mountains. It's, just night and day. Some of the other leading causes of death, as I mentioned, cancer is a huge one. It kills 8.2 million people a year. In the U.S., prostate and breast cancer are the most common for men and women. And here you can see the details of a study that was done on men with early stages of prostate cancer. All of these guys were in very early stages, and they were advised on kind of just wait it out before you get any kind of intervention, any kind of surgery, radiation, etc., because it was such early stages, and they wanted to see what they could do with diet. And what they did was they took the people and put them on a vegan diet for a year, and they were taking blood samples from the guys, and then taking a petri dish with cancer cells, prostate cancer cells, and dropping their blood onto the cancer cells. And what they could show was that the people in the control group eating the standard diet, they were able to kill about 9% of the cancer cells in the petri dish. The guys on the vegan diet, they could kill 70% of the cancer cells in the petri dish. So that's almost 8 times as many for the guys eating the vegan diet versus the standard American diet. And again, I said this is with people who already had prostate cancer themselves. And you can see the note below there that none of the guys following the vegan diet had to undergo any kind of treatments, but 6 of the control patients underwent treatments because their PSA levels were going up. And you can see that the PSA decreased 4% on average for the experimental group and increased 6% for the control group. So that's a pretty astounding study. And then what they did was they wanted to see if this was, similar for women, and they took a group of women and put them on a vegan diet for 2 weeks, and they did the same kind of blood on the petri dish, cancer cells, and they could see similar results after only 2 weeks on a vegan diet. So pretty incredible. Okay, the largest ever prospective study on diet and cancer also showed that vegetarians had lower cases of all cancers combined than meat eaters. So that's actually a really pretty significant study as well. I think there were like 500,000 people. I don't remember the specifics. You can check the details in the link. In another study of over 6,000 people, they looked at people in kind of middle age, 50 to 65. They broke them up into various groups. They could see based on their diet, whether they had high protein intake or moderate or low or none, and they followed them for 18 years. And what they found was that the people in the high protein intake group, they had 75% increase in overall mortality, and they had 400%, so a 4-fold increase in cancer death risk during those 18 years. And what they also found was that those associations were abolished if you looked at the people getting plant protein, so basically the people not eating animal protein. And what they said was that these risks are comparable to smoking. if you look at the World Health Organization's Agency for Cancer Research in 2015, they actually released a new classification for processed meat, calling it a known carcinogen, and they also said that red meat is a probable carcinogen, so that's a one level down from a known carcinogen. And if anybody's not sure what red meat means, red meat is actually all meat coming from any mammal, so not a fish or a bird. That is red meat. The next time you're trying to decide what you should make for dinner, just keep that in mind, that it's not just the processed meats. Those are known carcinogens, and the red meat is a likely carcinogen. Sorry, a probable carcinogen. That's the right word. So going on, continuing with the cancer theme here, in the U.S., colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of cancer deaths. And, there are lots of studies showing that increased fiber decreases your risk of colorectal cancer. Another thing to note is that plants typically contain lots of fiber. Animal products typically don't contain any, because fiber is only found in plants. So usually, people eating vegetarian or vegan diets, you tend to get more fiber by default. There's studies that show that only 3% of Americans eat the recommended minimum amount of fiber. That's a pretty shocking figure when you look at the other way around. Only 3% of Americans don't get the minimum amount of protein, but everyone is worried about getting enough protein, and nobody's worried about getting enough fiber. Another study that was very interesting showed that the colon cancer rates in Black Africans is 1/17 of that found in white South Africans. But interestingly enough, when they actually brought in people and did a study with them, they found that the low prevalence cannot be explained by dietary protective factors, such as the fiber, calcium, vitamins, and folic acid. They were actually influenced greatly by the absence of aggressive factors, such as the excess animal protein and fat. And what they showed was actually quite surprising, because the Black Africans, even though they had the lower rate of the colon cancer, they actually consumed less fiber, they had less fruits and less vitamins, they were more overweight, they were less active, so they were doing less exercise than the white South Africans, but they still had the lower rates. And they proved this by cell proliferation studies, which is quite interesting as well. And what they saw was that when they did the dietary analysis, the Black Africans were eating a third of the animal protein that the white South Africans were, and they were ingesting only about half of the cholesterol that the white South Africans were consuming. And naturally, because of the lower amount of cholesterol being ingested, their cholesterol levels, their blood serum cholesterol levels were also 35% lower. So those are very interesting figures as well. Stroke, as I said again, was the second leading cause of death worldwide. It kills 6.2 million people a year. And what causes it? It's generally accepted that high blood pressure, heart disease, high cholesterol, and diabetes, they all kind of are risk factors for stroke. What can you do to limit your chances? Well, you can limit your sodium intake. There are lots of studies that show that can greatly decrease your chance of getting stroke. And then also you can increase your potassium intake. And what the statistics here show is that 99.5%, so virtually almost the entire U.S. population, takes in more than the recommended maximum sodium allowance for the day. And less than 2% of the population takes in the recommended minimum potassium, which is pretty shocking, again, similar to the fiber statistic. If you look and you'll see that there are studies that if you increase your potassium intake by just a little over 1.5 grams a day, you have 21% lower risk of stroke. Potassium is really found abundantly in fruits and veggies. The study that I put here at the end shows that if you have 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables a day, you have a 26% lower rate of risk compared with even just 3 or fewer servings. Diabetes is another terrible disease that affects a great number of people. You can see that it killed almost 1.6 million people in 2014. And again, nothing new here, but treatments from the 1930s have already shown that a plant-based diet can help control type 2 diabetes, for example. In 1979, they showed that within 16 days, almost half the participants that they tested, they were able to get off of insulin. Some of these people had been taking insulin for up to 20 years. And what they did was they compared the people when they came in eating the standard diet. They put them on the plant-based diet, and then they took readings again. So they had the baseline, and then they looked at the end to see what the results were, and they compared them. And what they found was that the 3-hour fasting glucose level test were lower in the patients on the high carbohydrate, high fiber diet than they were on the standard diet, despite the fact that they were taking lower, or in some cases no, insulin injections. So that's actually pretty amazing. And then the other thing that you can note here is that their cholesterol levels dropped from an average of 206 down to 147, which again is below that optimal level that I mentioned for your total cholesterol being below 150. So that's actually quite amazing. And this was only after 16 days of a vegan diet. And this is not new information. This is from 1979. And then I also want to go back to the study I mentioned before on cancer, the same one that found that you have a 4 times higher chance of dying from cancer for being in the high animal protein consumption group. It showed that you have a 73 times chance of dying from diabetes being in the high protein group. So when they looked at the moderate protein group, they only had a 23 times chance of dying, a higher chance of dying from diabetes. So as compared to the no meat group. So again, just people always say everything in moderation, but everything in moderation is 23 times as likely to die from diabetes as 73 times as likely. Pretty bad. Okay. How does type 2 diabetes react to a vegan diet? There's a lot of information that shows that basically the thing that causes the type 2 diabetes response is the kind of clogging of the insulin receptors in your cells. And what happens is, even though your body is flooding itself with insulin trying to clear the sugar from your blood, the receptors are blocked and they can't process the sugars. So then your sugar spikes and you get the elevated blood sugar, which is unhealthy, and that's kind of the problem. And what happens is that if you eat a healthy vegan diet, you will slowly clear that fat that's clogging the receptors. The insulin receptors start working again, and you're able to process and clear the sugar out of your blood. So that actually allows people to be able to reduce the amount of insulin that they have to inject to clear the blood sugar. There's also a lot of evidence that links diabetes to environmental toxins. And the important thing I want to note here is that the study showed that 95% of the organic pollutants that we ingest come through the consumption of animal fats, so things like fatty fish, meat, and dairy products. That's an astounding figure. I mean, it's virtually all of the organic pollutants that you're accumulating through your diet are coming from these animal products. And there, like I said, is a strong correlation between that and diabetes and obesity. There's also a lot of studies that show that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune response to drinking cow's milk or being exposed to it if you have certain kind of genetic predisposition at early stages of childhood. Now we're going to move on to kind of like brain health and things related to dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, neuro kind of illnesses. So you can see that Alzheimer's and dementia killed over 1.5 million people in 2015. Alzheimer's was first recognized in 1907 by Dr. Alzheimer, and when he did an autopsy on his first patient that he diagnosed with this illness, he could see that there was extensive atherosclerotic damage. So there was clogging of the arteries in the brain for that patient. And I'm going to read this quote, but basically, vascular cognitive impairment is now recognized as a distinct group of interrelated vascular-based neurological insults that can accumulate and lead to dementia. What that means in layman's terms, to the best of my ability, is that basically that repeated kind of damage that people have by the arterial function being worsened by the plaque just keeps building and leads to dementia, because you're getting reduced blood flow and you're injuring your brain by these things happening. There is a substantial body of evidence collected from epidemiological, correlative, and experimental studies that strongly associate atherosclerotic vascular disease with Alzheimer's disease specifically. So, here's another study that they matched 272 people for age, sex, and zip code, and they showed that the people who ate meat were 2 to 3 times more likely to become demented as the vegetarian people in the study. And there's a great link here that I included, which goes through a lot of recommendations for improving and maintaining your brain health. But basically, for optimal health, they recommend minimizing the intake of saturated and trans fats. They want you to take vitamin E from food sources, so basically all your colorful plants. I've made a video about this, about eating the rainbow. And basically avoiding any multivitamins with iron and copper, because that can also build up in the brain and not be good for you. And getting exercise, and that doesn't have to be extreme amounts of exercise. You can see that their recommendation is simply 40 minutes of brisk walking 3 times a week, which is not a crazy amount of exercise. Kidney failure is an interesting one. It killed almost 50,000 people. You can see in the U.S. alone in 2014. It's been shown that high dietary intake of animal fats and red meat can increase your risk for microalbuminuria. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a marker of kidney disease. They're basically measuring certain biomarkers, I believe, in your urine, and then basically they can extrapolate that to certain values and see whether or not you have a chance of kidney disease. They think that the cause of this is related to, again, the little blood vessels that go into the kidneys. They're highly vascular, and if you have plaque forming in your arteries, that does happen through your whole body and not just in your heart. Diets rich in fruits and vegetables are effective at reducing urinary excretion of markers of renal injury in patients with stage 2 chronic disease. It's also been shown that low protein diets are typical treatments and are effective at helping people with kidney failure. So hypertension, as I've mentioned, is high blood pressure. There are over 30,000 deaths in the U.S. alone yearly. It affects 78 million people in the U.S., which is an astounding figure. And that means that nearly 1/3 of the adults in the U.S. have hypertension, and there's another 1/3 that have prehypertension. It's so prevalent that many doctors and people believe that it's a natural consequence of aging, but that's actually not true. And you can see that through many different studies over the course of many decades. In 1929, you can see that over a 2-year period in Kenya, they studied 1,800 patients, and there were no incidents of hypertension or atherosclerosis found. It should be noted that those people ate primarily plant-based diets, and their blood pressure actually dropped the older they got. Same things were found in rural China. The 70-year-olds had the same blood pressure as the 16-year-olds. The prevalence of hypertension has been getting worse as more and more people throughout the world, and here in this study shows in Africa, specifically as they adopt a Western diet, their hypertension rates go up. You can see the rates from 1970s going from 8.6 going up to 22.5 during a 10-year period starting in the year 2000. So there is another study here that shows that 89,000 Californians have a continual improvement in their blood pressure levels. The moves you go from like omnivorous to semi-vegetarian to vegetarian to pesco-vegetarian to lacto-ovo and then to vegan. Basically, as you go along that spectrum, the hypertension numbers just keep getting better and better. You can see the same thing for overall heart health, cancer deaths, diabetes, all sorts of other stuff too. In a study of 1,600 some odd patients eating a low-fat, high-carbohydrate, plant-based diet, you could see that over the course of 7 days, they lost weight, they had lower cholesterol, they lowered their blood pressure. And their blood pressure was lowered despite discontinuing medication for blood pressure, for high blood pressure at the beginning. And you can see the last stat there that the patients who had a high chance of cardiovascular event within the next 10 years, that was measured as 7.5 at baseline. They dropped that risk down to 5.5 at the end of day 7. So that's a pretty good improvement as well. Okay, so Parkinson's disease is another disease that affects a lot of people. It's the latest stats that I could find showed that 10 million people suffer from this illness worldwide, and it's been shown that diets high in animal fat or cholesterol are strongly associated with an increased risk for Parkinson's. Milk consumption is strongly implicated. They suspect that it might be related to high pesticide content. And there are studies, as I point out here, that the American Cancer Society, for example, found that you have twice the incidence of getting Parkinson's disease being in the highest consumer group of milk. And then I just want to reiterate the point I made before, that 95% of the environmental toxins that people consume in their diet come from fatty fish, meat, and dairy products. So if pesticides are really kind of the cause, or at least one of the contributing factors to Parkinson's, you want to minimize that. And one of the easiest things you can do is, not eat animal products, especially the fatty animal products, because, that's where the toxins bioaccumulate. Okay, multiple sclerosis affects 2.3 million people globally. This is another horrible degenerative disease that typically gets worse and worse as you progress through it. And there is a very interesting dietary intervention that has helped many people with MS. It's called the Swank diet, named after the doctor who came up with it. And basically, it's been shown that 95% of the patients that he treated with this diet were able to stop the progression of the disease over the course of 34 years. In fact, there was a 50-year follow-up of some of his subjects who were still alive, and they were still, alive and kicking, and their disease had not progressed and not gotten any worse. And there was a medically reviewed, peer-reviewed assessment of his 34-year follow-up study, and the quote here comes from that review, and it said that no medication or invasive procedure has ever come close to demonstrating such success. So that's a very high praise for a simple dietary intervention for people with a really serious illness. And you can see there that the Swank diet limited saturated fat intake to 10 grams a day, which again, as I said, saturated fat is primarily found in animal foods and very little in plant foods. So what now? Well, I think my message here is go vegan. You can greatly reduce the risk you have of dying from heart disease and other diseases like cancer and stroke, and some of these other neurological diseases that I mentioned as well. I think today's illnesses are really caused not by what everyone is always afraid of, which is some kind of nutritional vitamin, whatever, macronutrient deficiency. Everyone's worried about not getting enough protein. But what's happening is that that's not what's causing these illnesses. What is causing our modern day diseases is the excesses of animal product consumption, and of course the inherent chemicals and pesticides and everything else that they contain, which is a sad fact of our environment being so polluted. But what I encourage everybody to do is don't take my word for this. Go and read this stuff yourself. Check out the links I put in this presentation. Go and read. There's a lot of information out there. It's very thoroughly researched and documented. I encourage everybody to give it a shot. Try it for a month. I would bet that you will try it and you'll like it. It's you'll be amazed at how great you feel. It's easy, and I really think it's something that everyone should try at the very least. Give it a month, and I would be really shocked if you didn't feel better. So where can you learn more? I think one great documentary that I recommend is Forks Over Knives. That's a really good one. I think that takes you through some good examples and shows a lot of this science in action. I recommend people read Dr. Greger's How Not to Die book. or you can watch his presentation. I've actually been quite inspired by his presentations. I took a lot of the material for this slide deck from his presentation, or from his book, or from the content from his website, nutritionfacts.org. I can't recommend that site highly enough. I really think he's quite enjoyable to watch as well. So he's quite a bit funnier than I am, I think, on these presentations. You should give it a shot. Another great resource, I think, is Dr. John McDougall's site. I really like Dr. McDougall because he's very practical, and I think the kind of things that he talks about, like keeping it simple, it's a lot less complex and complicated to get the nutrients and get the nutrition that you need than people make it out to be. I think a lot of times people try to scare you into thinking like it's really difficult, doing a vegan diet, but I really think it's actually quite simple. Another movie that you can watch if you want to know about the environmental impact of eating animals, you can watch Cowspiracy. That's a pretty good one, and it takes you through a lot of the facts and figures around eating animals and how that impacts the environment. And then if you really want to get into the ethical side of things, I really recommend that everybody watch Earthlings. I will be doing subsequent videos on the ethics of eating animals and veganism, so come back for that, but this video is going to be long enough as it is, and I think just if somebody's interested in that, you should definitely check out that movie. It's a real tearjerker in a way, but really eye-opening as well. So yeah, with that, I think really, I kind of want to finish here. I can give you just a really quick summary of kind of what I've learned from my experiences. A vegan diet consisting of whole plant foods is really, I think, the healthiest way to eat. You get all of the nutrients and vitamins and minerals that you need. I do take vitamin B12. I'm going to talk about that in a separate video, why. But aside from that, I don't take any supplements, no vitamins, no nothing. B12 is the only thing I really feel I should take, and I'll explain why later. I think that the vegan diet is very easy once you learn how to kind of prepare food for yourself, and if you already know how to cook, it's really easy to switch over to a vegan diet. I think there's really no challenge. You just have to change your mindset, and within a couple weeks, I think it's really easy to make an adjustment. It's obviously great for the environment. There's lots of studies that show positive impact, lower water usage, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what I've come to believe is that the only good reason to keep eating animals is because you like the taste. There's just no other good excuse, and I'll make a separate video about some of the excuses that and my responses to them of why people keep eating animals. But that's a big topic as well. So I just want to wrap up. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will be posting a subsequent video kind of talking about the excuses that I mentioned, and maybe do some additional things about vitamins and minerals and things like that of concern that people always kind of fearmonger around veganism. But yeah, I think give it a shot, check out some of this stuff. I think you will be pleasantly surprised. And yeah, thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and share this with a friend. I hope you got something out of that, and hope to see you back soon. Thanks. Bye.